it seems impossible to come up with a kind of transparent and rational, well-integrated model for the economic system that we live in, because we live in a fundamentally crisis-ridden system that is frequently breaking down, pits different sections of the economy, different classes against each other, and is just host to a number of processes that over time lead to these really damaging and harmful breakdowns.
The Rational View is a weekly series hosted by me, Dr. Alan Scott, providing a rational, evidence-based perspective on important societal issues.
Produced by Soapbox Media.
The world needs evidence-based public policy now more than ever. Making the right decisions should not be partisan politics. Please help spread The Rational View by going to patron.podbean.com/TheRationalView. Together, we can make a better future. Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Rational View. I'm your host, Dr. Al Scott. In this episode, I'm dipping my toes into a new topic, a little bit outside of my range, but it's something that I think we can use the tools of science to rigorously investigate. It's the economy, modern monetary theory, if you've heard of it. It's a recent idea that clashes with classical economics. The idea that governments whose dollar is not tied to a standard, a gold standard, say, can print money and don't need to worry about absolute deficits. It encompasses the idea of guaranteed employment for all. The discussion is also going to incorporate something about the end game of capitalism. We seem to be in the dying days of the capitalist system. My guest has written the book on it. Let's get grounded in the facts. If you like what you're hearing, please press like on your podcast app. Come visit me on my Facebook group, The Rational View, and give me your impressions of this. I'd love to hear from you. Jamie Merchant is a writer living in Chicago who writes about political economy and radical political theory. His writing has appeared in many publications, including The Baffler, The Brooklyn Rail, The Nation, and In These Times. His book, Endgame, Economic Nationalism and Global Decline, was published by Reaction Books in 2024. Jamie, welcome to The Rational View.
Thank you very much for having me.
I'm very interested in the case for and against modern monetary theory as a way to understand economics. Could you give us an introduction to what modern monetary theory is and how it differs from what we'd be used to as classical economic theory?
Yeah, definitely. So the basic idea behind what's come to be called modern monetary theory is that the government, or at least a government that prints its own currency, does not take out debt in another currency. And that is to say, it issues debt in its own currency and collects taxes in its own currency, is not limited by any kind of hard budget constraints in the amount of money that it can spend, because it ultimately is the source of issuance for the currency that the rest of the society has to use, is forced to use in order to purchase goods, to exchange goods and services, to circulate economic resources, and so on. And so it's not as if there's like a finite amount of money in the government's bank, let's just say for the sake of a simple metaphor, in the government's bank account, right, at the Federal Reserve. It's not as if the Treasury, the US Treasury, has like a finite amount of money that it has to budget out, and it can only spend that amount of money every year, or it's going to go bankrupt. That would be a kind of like traditional orthodox view of money and public finances. But rather, the government spends money first into the economy through its programs, through its agencies, through its various legislative initiatives. And then that money circulates through the economy and moves people and goods and services around, creates tax revenue then later for the government to collect, which it then is able to collect and sort of recirculate in whatever way it sees fit. So there's no hard budget constraint, MMT argues, right?
Okay.
but rather you're limited by, the main thing you're limited by is the amount of physical goods, basically, and infrastructure in the economy. Because if you pump too much money into the economy, you will get inflation. And so the only thing, the only real limit to government spending is that inflationary limit. It's not, like I said before, this amount of money that's just sitting in a bank somewhere that the government can spend.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
I mean that does make sense, but it seems almost like a tautology. It seems like, yes, this is exactly how money works. Money is created and destroyed by central banks. But isn't it just the other side of a coin from, supply and demand? Isn't it the same thing? How is this different from modern or from classical economics?
So again, a classical economist would take up the viewpoint of, like, we could take this perspective, right? Like what's called in economics the quantity theory of money, right? Which says that there's a finite amount of basically like economic activity happening in a given economic order, and what causes inflation, what causes a general price rise across the economy is too much money chasing too few goods and resources, right? This is kind of like a classic liberal theory of money and the price level. So you're right in that MMT, in the most basic sense, there's a kind of agreement there, because they're arguing that inflation is the limit, right? And there's no hard, like, there isn't just gold or money sitting in a bank account that is the limit to what the government can spend. But at the same time, that affords way more latitude for the government to spend basically as much as it needs to reach full employment, to employ everyone in the economy at a living wage, or at least up to as high a level as possible without triggering inflation. And it can do that essentially whenever it wants to. There's no drawbacks. Whereas a neoclassical, economics point of view or perspective would definitely sort of pump the brakes on that and want to say that no, in fact, if you do spend like this, like on this sort of unlimited, in this kind of nearly unlimited manner, it's going to tank the value of the currency. It's going to lead to potentially a wage-driven price spiral, or what they call a wage-driven price spiral, where overheated economic activity pushes up wages across the economy, which then begins to eat into corporate profits, and so that leads to a general kind of slowdown, and it's a kind of self-defeating policy at the end of the day, because yes, workers' wages might be going up, but ultimately that's going to eat into corporate profitability, and that affects the ability of corporations to reinvest and to grow, right, the rest of the economy. So, like, neoclassical economists would want to point to these like limits, and say that this is an irresponsible policy for these reasons. And MMT, theorists and economists would disagree and argue that no, we can, through rational government management, all of these potential problems can be managed, can be negotiated, and can be controlled at the end of the day until we reach full employment and a growing economy.
Sure. I'm a little bit surprised that there's controversy over which of these is correct, that we don't have quantitative models of the economy that can just be put out to solve these problems, or decide how much money can we invest. Like, surely you can model the economy quantitatively and come to a solution, or is that not possible? What limits that?
You're asking, like, what limits the ability to model the economy accurately enough, right?
Yeah.
So that it could play out smoothly, basically.
to figure out which of these models is correct. Or, let's say we do an MMT thing. We inject enough money to have universal employment. Certainly there's models of production, models of pricing. What is missing from closing the loop?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a complex and deep question. I mean, essentially the program of the economics profession, from its inception, right, has been to offer all of these models of the economy, all these macroeconomic models, now more so, not entirely, but the emphasis is more so on the microeconomic side these days. And going back to the classical political economists, right, like Adam Smith, David Ricardo, figures like that, the idea, was that you could come up with an abstract set of equations and formulas that could accurately model the economy, and potentially lead to a kind of smooth trajectory of economic growth, right? And it was all based on this idea of markets as this kind of self-correcting, self-equilibrating system, right? Where because of like the forces you mentioned earlier, right, the fundamental forces of supply and demand, you start out with a situation, you're modeling it on the basis of a set of agents who start off with a given amount of resources, and they're going to make the optimal set of deals and take the right actions so that they exchange with each other, and everyone ends up with the rational distribution, the most rational and preferable distribution, right? That was basically, that idea in different forms ruled economics up until sort of the beginning of the 20th century, when the role of the government in national economies, especially in the advanced sort of capitalist countries, was growing. It was getting bigger through things like social insurance programs, like trade union collective bargaining agreements, the need for what we would now call industrial policy, but back then they just called like tariffs, like legislative tariffs and taxes on foreign trade and so on. The government was taking a bigger and bigger hand in the national economy. And this was something that economists sort of ignored, or were mostly able to ignore in their modeling, up until the Great Depression, the Great Crash and the Great Depression of 1929, and then throughout the 30s. Not entirely ignore, but I should say that's when it became impossible to ignore, right? Because everyone with a brain could look at what was happening during the Great Depression, which was global, and see that there was no self-correcting market, like equilibrium, evening everything out, right? It was only getting worse, and it was only, if it was getting better, it was very slow. And that was because governments were frantically, right, experimenting with new ideas to get the national economies going again, right, to bring them up out of the depression. And so then you have a whole new tradition that enters the economic modeling like space, which is the Keynesian tradition of economics, which is essentially the foundation of macroeconomics as we know it, right? Okay. The attempt to I know I'm going on for a very long time about your question.
This is good, helpful background for laying the basis of a good discussion.
Yeah, because because your question was about modeling, and so this is what I'm getting at is that like the way modeling works has changed so drastically throughout the history of economics and just social theory and the social sciences, right? When the Keynesian economists sort of took control during the Great Depression, they developed these much more elaborate sort of macroeconomic models of the economy that were much more sophisticated than the kind of classical supply and demand market focused models of the earlier economics profession.
Okay.
And so it was essentially a sea change, right, in the way that modeling works. And so I guess what I would say there's much more to be said after that about how modeling has changed in the kind of economics domain since then. But I think the point is that the capitalist economy, the global capitalist economy, goes through these tremendous, like really earth-shaking cycles of crisis that every 30 or 35 years or so kind of throw the received wisdom into question and force everyone, especially economists, to try to think of new ways to model the economy. And so that's how I would answer that question, is that like there's never been, it seems impossible to come up with a kind of transparent and rational and well integrated kind of model for the economic system that we live in, because we live in a fundamentally crisis-ridden system that is frequently breaking down and pits different sections of the economy, different classes, against each other, and is just host to a number of processes that over time lead to these really damaging and harmful breakdowns, right? And so it's hard to model a system that is self-contradictory, if that makes sense.
Wow. So it seems like there's basic assumptions that are still not agreed on how the economy works, which is a little frightening when you look at it. But getting back to modern monetary theory, I know you're not necessarily a proponent of modern monetary theory, but we've seen the U.S., for example, the U.S. Fed printing trillions of dollars in financial easing without, at the time, significantly impacting the value of their currency. How many billions they spent in 2008 after the market crash. Isn't this some evidence of the success of the theory?
Yes. I mean, the theory gets something, it does get something right, which is that it gets something right for the United States, which is that because of the unique, actually they wouldn't put it this way, but this is, I guess, where my kind of more skeptical attitude would start coming in, right? Mm-hmm. You're right that U.S. spending is able to just go off in these gonzo directions and take these just enormous volumes that other countries can't. And although we did have a significant inflationary spike, right, over the last few years, that's been kind of receding lately, the more convincing explanation for that is not that it was driven by the state spending necessarily, but that it was driven by the global supply chain shocks and corporate profiteering, right? Like corporations jacking up their prices, taking advantage of the supply shocks and so on. So, so we have had that big inflationary spike, but there's a very good argument to be made. It wasn't because of the government spending. But what allows the United States to pursue these fiscal programs is the unique role of its currency in global financial markets. Like essentially, it is the most high. It is the currency that is globally in the most high demand. Right, investors and traders and speculators and shippers, businesses, every kind of corporation in the world has a need to do business. If they're a global business, they need access to U.S. dollars. U.S. stock markets are by far and away the biggest in the world. The U.S. bond market, the dollar bond markets are the biggest and deepest bond markets in the world. Because the U.S. dollar is considered, and U.S. assets are considered the safest assets in the world. U.S. Treasury, in particular, U.S. state debt, right, is considered to be it's like the benchmark for the safest asset among financial investors worldwide. And so, because there is this really outsized demand for the U.S. dollar globally, that gives the U.S. a huge amount of room to pursue these expansionary fiscal policies that other countries would not have access to, because it would, in a lot of cases, devalue their currencies, right? If they were to spend on the level that the US does, but without that strong foreign demand for their currency, it would have a debilitating effect. Whereas because the US dollar is so strong globally and there is such high demand for it globally and domestically, it is able to pursue these very strong expansionary fiscal policies. So that's something that MMT theorists typically, I won't say they ignore it, but it's not something they're going to want to emphasize because they want to argue that their theory applies to any country that, again, prints its currency, taxes in its currency, and issues its own debt in its currency. But not every country is going to have the strength of the US dollar backing it up, right? And so even if a country meets those three criteria, if no one wants to buy their debt, right, or if no one wants to hold their currency, no investors want to touch it because the government is going on a major spending spree or something and they don't like it, they will just sell the currency, right? And it will severely damage the currency and particularly that society. So that's what I mean by it's like it does get something right.
It's very interesting. You make the point that the U.S. is special because they have the fiat currency of the world, and it seems to me that currencies are basically set by the whims of the people that hold the most capital, which seem to exist in the U.S. Is that a fair statement?
Insofar as they are the ones investing in the currency and the ones making the decisions about what to invest in, right? Yes, it is the people who hold the capital.
I mean,
who make those calls.
And is that because they're no longer tied to a physical standard like a gold standard? So freeing it from this gold standard means that you no longer have this direct link between your currency value and the number of dollars that you have. Now it's set free to be set by the oligarchs who control the system.
Yeah, that's more or less it. I mean, when the dollar, when the gold standard was just discarded, everyone, pretty much everyone, was freaking out because it was an unprecedented situation. The only other time the world had gone off gold, the world economy, the capitalist economy had done that was during the Depression, right? When everyone was descending into their own very super nationalist kind of developmental programs, and then that eventually led to another global war. And so in the 70s, there was a lot of anxiety around what was going to happen when the U.S. took the dollar off of the gold peg. But nevertheless, and that's another. I mean, we can certainly talk about that if you want. But the way things played out was that the U.S. was able to eventually, through a series of events that played out at the end of the 70s, including the. I mean, we talk about how the recent interest rate hike was bad. I mean, back in the early 80s, Paul Volcker, ratcheted interest rates up to almost 20%, right? And the result was a huge inflow of global of money into the dollar because the interest rates were so much higher here than everybody else, everywhere else, as a result. And it did profound and terrible damage to the global, particularly countries in the global South, all that capital flight. But that made the U.S. able to kind of rebuild its economic strength on this financialized basis, based on empowering the holders of capital, and particularly financial capital, like you're saying, right? We call them financial oligarchs. This new economic order just built on inequality through increasing power in the financial system and in the financial system's power over the rest of society. That kind of solidified into a kind of growth path, if you like, in the 80s, kind of what we could call the beginning of the neoliberal era. And that is essentially led into this kind of oligarchic formation that we have now.
Yeah,
Although now it's changing in interesting ways that we could get into as well if you like.
yeah, I'm interested in both. I mean, I'm interested in what's happened since the 70s. I've seen graphs, for example, of GDP growth versus worker wage growth that show significant decoupling after 1970, at least for the West. And this has been suggested to indicate that all the productivity growth since 1970 has mainly lined the pockets of billionaires, leaving the workers kind of in the dust. And there are critics of this assessment. Recently, I've seen some papers, a paper by Robert Lawrence, that says our workers are no longer producing as much of the things that they consume. So things they build, like industrial machinery, have stayed cheap, while things they need, like food and houses and gas, have skyrocketed. But this seems to be a bit of a cop-out to me. My impression is that much of the GDP growth is based on profits from paper shuffling and financial industry work in the West. And so that may play a part in this decoupling between consumables and producibles. But either the GDP growth is real and workers are being disenfranchised, or GDP growth is illusory and the economy is based on a house of cards. Which is it? Both are bad.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting formulation there. Like, it's GDP growth. It's both real and not real, I guess is how I would come at that, in the sense that it, the agencies who track this, right? Like the National Bureau of in the U.S., the National Bureau of Economics, the National Labor, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and the federal agencies, they have built up this elaborate and systematic statistical method over the last 60 years or so, in partnership with mostly Europe, but also Japan to some degree. The rich, the advanced capitalist countries mostly are the people who built this statistical system. And GDP, so basic definition is it measures all the goods and services produced within the borders of a national country, of a nation state in a certain amount of time. And it makes no differentiation between, whatever it may be, right? So it can be anything from buying something at the store to collecting a fee as a lawyer to work, to being paid as an assembly line worker in a factory, a financial broker who takes a fee or something, right? But the point is, what it's measuring is just purely the economic transaction. And so, if you one example is if you're driving your car like a maniac down the road, drinking a handle of whiskey and smoking some cannabis that you bought at the dispensary.
It's a good day.
Listening to a really expensive radio or something, sound system in your car that you paid a bunch of money for, and then you wreck the car, and then you take it to a mechanic to repair it, right? Mm-hmm. You're like a GDP national hero, because you've spent all that money on all of those goods, even though you're actively you're a menace to society, basically. And so GDP it makes no distinction among those kinds of categories. And furthermore, it there's an interesting debate, right, going back to the foundations of the concepts of of what go into GDP, when the economists, we were talking about before, the Keynesian economists who kind of developed macroeconomics in the 30s in response to the Great Depression, when they also they developed this concept of GDP that came out of that period of sort of economic innovation, when they were trying to figure out what national income is. And this economist, Simon Kuznets, it's very famous economist, emigre economist from Europe, from Russia, actually. And he had some misgivings about the way that GDP, he himself basically didn't invent it single-handedly, but he's a major figure in its invention. He had major disagreements about these things, we should not include socially harmful activities in GDP, right? We should make value judgments about what we include in it, what we should not include in it. Maybe things like advertising and financial speculation don't belong in it, right? Like maybe we draw a line, and we say that only certain like activities are producing true economic value, and that's what will go into it. And interestingly, he and some others also didn't agree with including government spending in GDP. GDP, as we measure it today, includes government spending as one of its components. And so when you think about that for a second, that's kind of weird, because we're supposed to live in a market-based capitalist economy, right? That's based on private ownership, not government spending. Yet we measure the strength of our private market-led capitalist economy by this indicator that includes government spending as a bigger and bigger component of it. And so there were disagreements. So there are disputes about whether or not that's valid. Is government spending, is it really contributing to economic activity, or is it an overhead cost of economic activity, right? It's like the government has to spend on roads and bridges and telecommunications and all of that stuff just in order to set the conditions for the private economy, right? From that perspective, it's more of like an overhead cost, perhaps. But anyway, the point is that there are arguments about all of this.
It should be based on value rather than just the economic dollar figure. You need to take into account whether you're building something that's durable, for example.
Yes.
And I think a lot of the GDP that we're getting these days is built on things that are not durable, that don't, that depreciate a lot faster than they used to, let's say. And in fact, that was one of Robert Lawrence's arguments against GDP being high. We're looking at gross GDP, not net GDP, and everything depreciates so fast these days.
Yes.
The actual value that we're getting from them is less, because it's
absolutely, and
especially
too, as corporations are able to lobby to get more and more like ever more friendly, like corporate friendly depreciation allowances on their investments, right? In the U.S. especially. So they're writing off assets like at a faster rate than the natural life of what these assets might be, right?
Interesting.
In order to get tax write-offs, essentially. So that's a factor too.
So getting back to modern monetary theory, you had said that it suggests that it should be possible to maintain universal employment. The government should just spend enough to make sure that everyone has a job and everyone's doing something. And this obviously is a threat to the capitalist model, where you need workers under duress to be competing for wages to allow corporate profits. And it looks like the corporations are winning. Can you comment on that characterization?
I think the MMT argument, is that that we can have full employment through something like a federal jobs guarantee, right? Federally funded jobs guarantee, where the government provides a job for everybody, and moreover, everybody who wants one, right? And moreover, they can do that without significant without new taxation. You don't have to. One of the craziest implications of MMT is that the government doesn't have to tax private businesses, actually, because it doesn't rely on tax revenue, right? It's like we were saying earlier, it spends the revenue first into the economy, and then it collects it back. And so the logical conclusion there is that you don't have to tax corporations, because that's how the economy works, like as a monetary economy.
Wow.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. So basically,
it's kind of a trippy
inflation
idea,
is based on the production on not having enough goods for the amount of money that's in the system. So if you're becoming more productive by giving these people jobs, there's more goods you don't need to tax, because there's not going to be inflation, because seems to be
Well,
reasonable.
the only reason you will need to tax is to control inflation, basically, is what they would say. You don't need to tax, like you don't need a corporate income tax for really sort of any other reason, because again, the government doesn't, right, like the basic reason for taxation, like conventionally the way we think of it, is to fund government services, but the government funds its self-funding, right, through MMT, in the MMT point of view. And so you would only need to then take money out of the system through taxation if you want to hedge against like rising prices and inflation, right? Like if the economy is becoming overheated.
Yeah. So there's two levers that I see in this discussion for controlling inflation. One is taxation through MMT, and through classical economics, the only lever is interest rates. So which is better for the people?
I mean, I think that, yeah. I mean, I think a better approach, maybe a more comprehensive approach that doesn't rely just on taxes and just on, well, let me put it this way. I know that some of the heterodox economists, right, who advocate MMT, for example, would not want to stop at that choice between just interest rates or just taxes for kind of like macroeconomic management. They would want to go further into things like potentially a system, like a well-managed system of like price controls, for example, potentially even capital controls, like controlling how much money flows from foreign investors into the country, putting limits on how much money can flow out of the country, like how much investment can go out of the country into financial markets, speculation, and global capital markets, and so on. And so they would be, at least a fair number of these economists are interested in things like capital controls and price controls, right? To make sure that to control inflation that way, and to make sure that basic goods can stay affordable for ordinary people, and so on. So
I mean, I can just hear the classical economists saying price controls don't work. You need the invisible hand of the market.
Exactly.
Look, I mean, it also raises the question of why workers aren't building the things that they need for consumption in GDP, and why the invisible hand isn't fixing that problem either. So I think you can go both ways on how good the invisible hand is, but definitely, looking at what I've learned in this, strong regulations are needed to, we've seen where unregulated capitalism leads us. We've seen the market collapse in 2008. We've seen we know about the devastation of the Depression, and you need what it says to me is you need to be thinking about this all the time. You can't just let it go with without regulation, or you're in a lot of trouble. So your book, Endgame, you're basically describing how our financial system is kind of in the stages of collapse. I think that's what I get from it. Can you maybe expand on that theory? Why do you see us in the end game of the capitalist system?
Well, collapses, I get it. But I'm not sure I would go with something as like abrupt as that. I think it's more of let's call it a slow motion collapse. I'll go with that. We can go with that.
Okay.
I might even use that phrase somewhere in the book. But what I try to get at is that we are in this long-term period of the financial system that has been really the engine of capitalist growth for like the last 30 or 40 years, has entered, for a variety of reasons, a new and very kind of a kind of unprecedented situation for it, in the sense that governments like the U.S. government, European governments, Japan, certainly China, are becoming more and more actively involved in their national financial systems. And they're getting more and more administratively involved, and they're making more and more drastic interventions into the financial markets and into the banking system and into their payment systems for all kinds of reasons. But in the U.S. case, it really comes from 2000. I mean, if we want to sort of take a starting point, the sort of policy response to the great crash of 2008 and the attempt of the policy elites to kind of shore up and refortify the banking system after that crash has resulted in a whole raft of policies that, I mean, according to the argument I make in the book, and in some of my other writing, has kind of amounted to removing more and more of the risk, the factor of risk from financial markets, in the sense that the government and the Federal Reserve particularly has bailed out the system now so many times. It has created all these new instruments and products that kind of act as like insurance of last resort for the banks and for the banking institutions that kind of bail them out if things ever get shaky, and they've been building this whole kind of suite of programs up for the last 15 years or so, that because they essentially make it very difficult for financial institutions and businesses in general, the biggest businesses at least, to fail, to go bankrupt. They implicitly have removed that element of risk, right? Like
Basically,
they're increasingly chipping away at it.
Socialism for the rich.
Well, yeah. Socialism for the rich and capitalism, private, cutthroat competitive capitalism for the rest of us.
With no safety net. And that's what the MMT was kind of rankles them, because having that safety net of universal employment would share the benefits with everyone. And you can't have that to have a capitalist system working. You discuss in your book also a topic that I'm very interested in, and I've seen it being used as a political football, is globalism. Free trade and all of this stuff that came out in the 80s and 90s, was brought in by, Republican and conservative governments. Who's it been good for? Has it been a good thing? I didn't really have a really good feel for it until I looked at your book, and I liked your opinion on it.
Thank you. So do you mean kind of like what people used to talk about with globalization?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a whole complex history of this idea of globalization, right? But to sort of cut it down to the basics in response to your question, if we go from sort of like if we start from the end of the Cold War, right? Like the collapse of the Soviet Union and the kind of inauguration of the U.S.-led international order with the U.S. as its kind of uncontested leader, most powerful country, and so on. That for about 20 or 25, about a good 20 or 25 years, up until the crash of 2008, 2010 or so, was seen as this period of global, what people were calling globalization, where the idea was that trade was going to get smoother and smoother and more open. It was going to become liberalized. Countries were going to get, sort of, the more they could deconstruct the barriers in their labor markets, which was economists speak for like unions basically, and get the government and bureaucracies out of the way of the private capitalist economy. It was going to lead to this like virtuous cycle of growth for countries all around the world, right, to participate in this new global economy. Human rights were being, the idea was that human rights were going to be universally recognized, and liberal democracy was going to spread, eventually all around the world. This is like the classic kind of end of history idea. that Francis Fukuyama put forward in the early 90s. And that eventually, right, like we have entered the era of capitalism triumphant. And so the only thing left for us to do is to just kind of tweak, tinker with it here and there and let it grow and make everyone prosperous, over a long enough time span. That project failed, and we're living in the aftermath of that great failure. But it didn't completely fail, right? And that's one of the things that I try to point out in the book is that, there were remarkable, some remarkable success stories in developing economies, especially China, right? Which during that period of globalization was able to take this remarkable developmental path that allowed it to, develop its economy and sort of grow its domestic market, grow wages, grow its workforce in a really remarkable way, right? That really did bring millions of people out of poverty. And other countries as well, had different levels of success with globalization during that period. One could maybe point to India as a kind of somewhat successful case. But nevertheless, countries, particularly in the global South, developing economies, they did make real tangible progress to some degree, catching up to the rich countries. They didn't fully catch up to the rich countries, but they closed the gap a little bit. All that, of course, though, came at the cost of skyrocketing inequality within countries, right? And that's a universal trend that happened everywhere.
Yeah.
So it's a complex, kind of spiraling process throughout the kind of period of globalization where you do have, on some indicators, inequality, like things were getting more equal, as some developing countries were able to catch up a little bit to the rich world. Turkey's another good case. But then in almost every country, without exception, that did see some development during the globalization period, you saw tremendously rising inequality within those countries, right? Domestically. So that's how I look at it. It's neither, as an ideological project and as kind of like as a project to put free market capitalism forward as the final solution to global development. It failed utterly, but nevertheless there were real successes, and there was real growth at the level of the kind of international comparisons that we've been talking about during that period.
You say it failed utterly. Can you expand on that? Like, what were the failures of globalization?
Again, this idea that if we get government out of the way of the private economy, and we let, for example, financial markets, we leave them open to run themselves and to let the market determine the best outcome. Let markets determine the best outcome, that was the principle that was going to lead to the best economic outcome. And instead, what we saw is that, no, what markets do is they don't rationally distribute resources so that it leads to the best possible outcome. Just some actors accumulate immense riches and monopoly power and information monopolies and all of that. And they take reckless actions that eventually lead to a crash of the entire system, which is what happened in 2008. Almost happened again in Europe in 2010, 2011 with the Eurozone crisis. Almost happened in China in 2015, 2016, when they were attempting to sort of liberalize their financial markets ever so slightly. And then came really close again in 2020 during the pandemic. That was the gambit, or the article of faith that guided globalization as this kind of ideological project, was that markets will rationally order human affairs, right? And that idea has been decisively disproven, right, by just crisis after crisis, and the need for ever expanding, like we were talking about earlier, ever expanding government interventions into national economies to correct these really dangerous crisis dynamics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think it outlines the problem quite well. What's the solution? What's the next stage? What do we see hope in any of these models and these extreme theories? Where should we be going next?
Small question.
Well, leave us with your thoughts.
Yeah, well, the way things are going now, and I realize now I should have sent this to you before, or maybe you did see it. But I wrote an essay last year for the Brooklyn Rail on industrial policy, and it's kind of like the sixth chapter of my book. But anyway, I'll send it to you after this. But
Thank you.
As you probably know, the consensus now among most of the kind of policy-making elite crowd is that they have recognized that it is a big mistake to leave the economy to the market, to markets to organize and to run, because it leads to staggering inequality, it leads to social instability, it leads to potentially inflation and all of these macroeconomic ills. And so now there has been this new turn to the idea of industrial policy as the way to address those failures. And I mean, you see this in the United States. You're seeing this more and more in Europe, although Europe is behind, really kind of for a variety of reasons. It's behind the U.S. on this. See it in Japan, South Korea, of course, China. I mean, China's been doing it, arguably the most successfully, the longest. But that idea of the globalization period, right, that the government is the problem and markets are the solution, has now it hasn't been totally inverted, but it's been, it's basically the governments have sort of tossed that aside and now recognize that states have to be doing something to, rein the excesses of the market in, to direct investment into high priority, like areas, like, really high value, advanced, technological systems that they believe are going to power the economic growth of tomorrow and so on.
So recognizing critical national needs that need to be supported effectively.
Yeah, but not always from a kind of not from a public good, social good perspective. Very often they're thinking about it from a kind of national security perspective. This has been what has been motivating a lot of U.S. quote unquote industrial policy, is the need to, again, in air quotes, like protect U.S. technology and secrets from China, basically. And they have identified great power conflict with China as the overriding objective for essentially everything that they want to do now. And so even this turn away from market dominance, that the recognition that something has to be done about inequality, something has to be done to help the working class catch up to capital and the oligarchs, like they have subordinated all of that to this broader geopolitical agenda of the need to beat China, essentially. And that, so they have learned about the failures of globalization and neoliberalism, but they're executing on that in this really perverse way that is tying industrial policy to this geopolitical, this really dangerous geopolitical agenda that right now is leading closer and closer to outright conflict with, it could be China in a certain amount of time, it could very well be Iran, but or another national enemy, who knows. But the point is that national security has sort of taken over this new turn to like government management of the economy at the expense of the need to run the economy more equally to benefit the greatest amount of people. So anyway, so you know,
Agree, that's perverse.
yeah. So it's like, so if we could do that, but get out or like remove the geopolitical hostility, that's the direction we should be going in. But this, unfortunately, and I mean, this is another long conversation we could have, but it seems to be baked in that the U.S. ruling class has decided that great power conflict with China and also like Russia and Iran, but especially China, mainly China, is the path to renewal for their political legitimacy and for the strength of the national economy. And so that's the world we're in.
Well, that's very insightful. I appreciate your insights, even though they don't have a whole lot of hope in them. Very realistic, I think. A good assessment and help us to define where we're at, which is, at least one of the biggest challenges of today is getting everyone on the same footing with facts and how things have worked. And I've gone through Naomi Oreskes' book, the big myth about neoliberalism and how that's been sold as a bundle of goods over the last century, effectively. So it definitely is in line with that thinking, and I think being aware of what the power brokers are trying to do is the first step in fixing it. So really appreciate your time coming to talk to us today. Thank you so much, and for spending your time. I'd be happy to send you a Rational View t-shirt. So
oh yeah, I think it was a really great conversation, and I really appreciate the invitation.
Thank you.
If you'd like to follow up with more in-depth discussions, please come find us on Facebook at The Rational View and join our discussion group. If you like what you're hearing, please consider visiting my Patreon page at patron.podbean.com/TheRationalView. Thanks for listening.